As I pointed out, we have very large budget deficits and we have accumulation of public debt in many countries. Now, the solution to this problem is known. We need in all countries that have excessive deficit to have a deficit reduction. And different countries are going to decide how much of this deficit reduction they want to do by reducing public government spending and subsidies as opposed to changing the revenues and increasing taxes. And different countries are going to make, based on their own democratic system, their own decision of how much they want to do one or the other one. However, there is an open question of whether many of these countries are going to politically be able to do very significant fiscal austerity or not. We don't know yet. There are open questions of whether in the short run this fiscal consolidation does not lead to even more slowdown of economic activity while it's necessary to achieve fiscal sustainability in the medium term. And therefore there are open questions about whether this fiscal adjustment can be achieved or not. Certainly, if that fiscal adjustment is not achieved, then the only other two options are either default or inflation. If a country is not able to achieve fiscal sustainability, if it borrows in a foreign currency and cannot monetize its budget deficits, like it happened in the past in countries like Argentina, Russia, Ecuador, and others, there could be sovereign default. If instead the country looks like the US or UK or Japan, and there is an option of monetizing the budget deficit, meaning the central bank running the printing presses, therefore a risk of an outright default is going to be limited. In this context, I would argue that the countries of the Eurozone look more like emerging market economies, even if they are borrowing in their own currency as opposed to borrowing in a foreign currency. Why? The US can have the option, like the UK, of easily monetizing its fiscal deficits, but in the case of the Eurozone, you have on one side fiscal authorities, and then you have one centralized monetary authority, that is the European Central Bank, that so far seems to be committed not to monetize these fiscal deficits. There are rules of the European Union and the treaty about no bailout by the central bank, and therefore countries like Greece look like more like emerging markets, even if they are borrowing in their own currency, meaning if Greece, and I'm not saying that's not going to happen, if Greece was not able to adjust fiscally enough, there is not an option of monetizing. The only option would be a coercive restructuring of its public debt. The problems of the Eurozone, of Greece, Portugal, Spain, and other countries, I would argue the following thing. First of all, as we do agree, these countries are facing very large budget deficits and very large stocks of public debt. Of course, you cannot lump them all together. Second point that is really important is that while the markets have stressed the concerns about large budget deficits and public debt, many of these countries in the periphery of the Eurozone face also an issue of external competitiveness and of lack, therefore, of economic growth. These were all countries that already, over a decade ago, were losing market shares to China, to Asia, to Turkey, to other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, because the exports of these countries in the periphery tend to be labor-intensive and low-value added. On top of it then, for a decade in the periphery of the Eurozone, we had wages growing more than productivity, therefore unit labor costs were rising, and that increase in the unit labor cost reflected itself in an appreciation of the currency in real terms of these countries, and this real appreciation based on unit labor costs led to a large and widening current account deficit. In some cases like Greece or Spain, even more than 10% of GDP. And therefore, when you have large current account deficits, you have an accumulation not only of public debt and public foreign debt, but you also have an accumulation of private debts and private foreign debts of the household sector, of the financial system, of the corporate sector. And the final nail in the coffin for this country was the very significant appreciation of the value of the euro between 2002 and 2008. The markets are not credibly convinced that these countries are going to be able to do the fiscal austerity and the economic reforms that are needed to restore growth, competitiveness, and fiscal stability. The money that the IMF and EU has essentially offered comes with significant amount of conditionality. all of these countries will have to do very painful fiscal austerity in order to get this money. And then there is also the question of whether, from a political point of view, in countries like Greece, but also Spain, Portugal, and other ones, there's going to be robust government committed to do the strong fiscal austerity that is necessary. The second question that is in the market is the question of what are the short-term economic consequences of this fiscal austerity. Now, everybody agrees that this fiscal austerity is necessary, because if you don't do the fiscal austerity, your interest rates on the government debt and the sovereign spreads are going to widen, and you're going to have loss of market access and then a fiscal crisis and financial crisis, so there is no alternative to do the fiscal adjustment. But in the short run, as we know, raising taxes and or cutting government spending has negative effects on economic activity. It may slow down further growth in some countries like Greece, Portugal, Spain, may continue to have a continued recession. And if you're going to have output falling, then achieving certain deficit and debt targets becomes harder. And then the final question that I pointed out is this question of loss of competitiveness and how to restore also economic growth. Now, the options on how to restore competitiveness and achieve a real depreciation, short of exiting the monetary union, something that is going to have dramatic effects, are very limited. One way of achieving a real depreciation could be to have many years of deflation, of falling in prices and wages in countries when these unit labor costs were rising. But usually, deflation is associated with a severe and continued recession. The right way, of course, of trying to restore competitiveness is by doing what Germany did. Accelerate structural reform, accelerate corporate restructuring, therefore increase productivity growth, keep a lead on nominal wage growth so that over time unit labor costs are falling, and that's going to lead to a restoration of competitiveness. But guess what? Even in the case of Germany, that process took 10 to 15 years. So deflation doesn't work, structural reform might take longer, therefore the only other option, probably short of exiting from the monetary union, is going to be one of a continued depreciation of the value of the euro.